All right. So, hi, my name is Melanie Gurko. I am the current podcast director at the Vanderbilt Political Review, and I am thrilled to have our second ever podcast guest with us today, Mr. Jon Meacham. For those of you who are not patrons of the Greenwich Public Library or frequent MSNBC viewers, Jon Meacham is a Pulitzer Prize winning author and presidential biographer. He is currently the Canon Historian at the National Cathedral, and most importantly, he is a professor here at Vanderbilt University.
Thank you.
So, to kick things off, in my time in your classes, we've picked
You're
up
very long-suffering, I must say. We're very impressed with
keep coming back.
Your durability, yes.
A lot of us that have been recurring students have picked up on these phrases that we call Meach-isms.
I like to be surprising. What are they?
There's a wide variety of them. Anything from you regularly referring to the Augustan definition of a nation to a frequent Lincoln quote.
Yep.
To like the moral arc of the universe. Name a at least moderately profound and generally succinct statement, and it works its way.
It's only moderately profound?
I said at least.
At least, okay. All right, fair. Good qualifier.
And generally they'll work their way into your lectures at some point.
Right.
So what has driven these reoccurring themes that are in your work and your lectures, and how do you think they end up resonating with people that are returning readers?
Oh, it's a great question, and thank you for having me. I really only have a couple of ideas, and they get framed and reframed. The central one is that we are a fallen, frail, and fallible people. That's probably on your list.
That's the one I forgot.
And that it's in human nature to do the wrong thing. The remarkable thing about civil society in general, and democracy in particular, is that just enough of us at critical moments have decided to do the right thing. And the fact that those are the exceptions to American history and global history, as opposed to the rule, I find unsurprising. And so the quotation from St. Augustine you mentioned, it's from the City of God. It said that a nation is a multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. And it's a three-pronged thing, right? There's a multitude, so there's some group of us. It presumes we're somewhat rational. That is, we have the capacity to make deferred decisions. And we have to love something in common. And at our best, in the United States of America, we have loved the notion of fulfilling the Declaration of Independence. And with that insight, that sounds grand, that point, I try to look at the events of a given era and judge whether or not that generation of both leaders and led met that test or didn't.
Mm-hmm. So on that kind of note, one of your works that has really focused on looking at these different eras and looking at it through that particular view is, I have it with me, because someone assigned it as a reading once.
Don't you travel with that every day?
No.
Okay.
So it's Soul of America. And I think a lot of people listening are going to recognize that message, not necessarily from your book, I'm sorry, but from President Biden's campaign rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So within that campaign, you notably had a role in shaping his speeches, giving them the historical context and kind of moral clarity, I guess, that they're known for. So how do you balance this need to speak to the moment with the broader frame of American history when working with speeches like this?
Also a good question. I believe that the moral utility of history is that examples from the past can show us, this is a Plutarchian point, can show us what to like and what to mislike, what to imitate and what to avoid. And so, and I believe that fundamentally that's a moral struggle. And in a democracy, we have to give as well as take. Fundamentally, contra John Locke, people want to take and not give. And the task of leadership, whether it's a president or somebody who has anyone who has people who will listen to them, is to point the way toward fulfilling a mission that is not simply about satisfying an immediate appetite. And I've been very lucky. President Biden is my friend. I've helped him when I could, as you say. It's a very unusual thing for me. I've never been involved in that level of politics, and would not have been, but for, I mean, honestly, what he did, he read that book and called me up. And that was that was not sort of the beginning, that was the beginning of this. And this sounds pretentious, and I don't mean it to be, but I, at the risk of sounding pretentious, his view of the country and the view I've developed in my work are aligned. Mm-hmm. And not everybody shares it, but it's a traditional, progressive, realistic, pragmatic, historically informed, morally inflected argument that the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, for all of their manifold failings and omissions, have proven to be durable guides to creating a more perfect union. Not a perfect one, but slightly more perfect. And I was honored to be asked to help someone I admire articulate those themes in the public square. I'm now retired. Got a couple of more with him, but it was a very particular episode, and I think that there's an open question about whether President Biden stood up to and turned back Trumpism, or whether he's a caesura between eras. And we'll know the answer to that in a month or so.
Yes. So moving to, I think something you're critiqued of is that you have a partisan bias, which I don't necessarily see at all, but I do see it when I read about you or
Sure.
in critiques about the class because of your work with President Biden.
I say sure that, yes, it's said.
Yes.
I don't agree with it, but that's okay. You can't be for the First Amendment for me and not for them.
Yeah. I think a lot of your work has kind of revolved around the general presidency, not partisanship. So where I'm going with this is you were President George H.W. Bush's biographer. In that time, after you had written his biography, you had become close with him. He asked you to deliver a eulogy for him, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
So within your eulogy, it was widely praised for being filled with grace and depth and talking about his life. How did you go about approaching the legacy of a president through the fact that you knew him personally?
So there are people who will let me do this in order on the partisan bias thing. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I have voted. I realized the other day, I did the math. I'm even in presidential votes between parties. And one of the things that is so frustrating about this era is that those of us who are not reflexively partisan, but who believe in a constitutional consensus, have found ourselves vulnerable to charges of reflexive partisanship because only one of the parties seems devoted to a constitutional consensus.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue I haven't moved, they have.
Yes.
So I think that's important to say. President Bush, I would like to believe, and I'm asked this question in various forms about, is it different writing about a living person than someone who's been gone? I actually, and this is something that some historians and biographers would dissent from, but my view, one person's view, is that I would like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson and Franklin Roosevelt, if they could come back and read what I said, to say it was fair.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I wanted with President Bush and Mrs. Bush. And so I don't, they didn't love every part of that book. And they shouldn't. A biography for someone late in life is a kind of summing up. And there is no summing up, with one exception I can think of, which I also wrote about John Lewis. There's no summing up of a human being that's not going to be marked by light and by shadow.
Mm-hmm.
I think the remarkable thing is that more than half the time, someone like President Bush, someone like President Roosevelt, President Jackson, President Jefferson, got as much right as they did.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm judging on a curve, but I think I'm judging on a curve that begins in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And so it was, one of the things I say about President Bush is I didn't fall in love with him, but I did come to love him.
Yeah.
And I miss him. And I would like to note for your listeners that George Herbert Walker Bush in 2016 voted for Hillary Rodham Clinton for president. But by my count, the only Democrat he ever voted for president. So is that a partisan bias?
So on this note of kind of polarization and seeing things through partisan lenses, what we've seen recently is a very public instances of the fragility of American democracy. So you've spoken about the fragility of democracy, especially through, as you mentioned earlier, just the general idea of human nature and historical cycles and what we continue to see. So do you believe that democracy, because of humans, is inherently unstable?
Yes.
And what are kind of like...
Yes, I do.
So, since yes, what are some of the key factors that exist within democracy, especially the American Constitution, that have allowed America to continue to endure?
Just enough of us have believed in the rule of law. And just enough of us have decided that we could defer immediate gratification in order to preserve a system, an arena, in which our interests might not prevail at one moment, but might in the next moment. And that it was a more secure and sure path to those interests prevailing to stay within the arena than to leave it. But that is a notional human element. There is no guarantee. If enough people want to do something different, it's going to happen. And do I wish it were inherently stable? Of course. But if it were inherently stable, there would be more of them, right? And I think what is remarkable about this period, and what I envy to some extent your generation being able to do, is you are seeing in the starkest relief possible the perils and the possibilities of this system. And there may be a lot of you who think this system is not worth preserving. I'm fascinated by, in your lifetime, the lifetimes of my children. I mean, in public life, you start with September 11th. You have the failure of weapons of mass destruction, intelligence in Iraq. You have the Great Recession. You have a biographically interesting but historically indispositive Obama presidency. You have the election of Donald Trump. You have COVID. You have January 6th. Why would you think that the public square could deliver? And so it puts a particular burden on aging people like me to tell stories about moments in which that public arena did provide progress. And I grew up in the shadow of World War II. I knew my grandfathers who had been, one fought in the Pacific, one fought in Europe. We prevailed over fascism. I grew up in the light of the civil rights movement. I was too young to be touched by it directly, but I grew up in a region that had been transformed 20 minutes ago. So that story was far more tactile to people of my generation and a little younger than people of your generation. And so one of the reasons you're here, one of the reasons you're at Vanderbilt, one of the reasons you are thinking about these things is how can you write a story that's going to be easier to pass on than the one my generation has shaped for you. So I don't know that let me put it this way, I don't know if America makes it. Mm-hmm. I think so. I think all in, taken all in all, we will in fact prevail in continuing to test whether or not we're going to prevail. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I will fact check you and say that I was not alive for 9/11.
I mean, you're broadly put. Mm-hmm. But wait, like J.D. Vance said, sometimes I just create stories to make a point. No, I'm just kidding. It's a joke.
I don't know if I quote him right now.
Oh.
So in this, you had mentioned January 6th as something that has kind of taken hope away from my generation. Mm-hmm. And you are quoted as saying that at the time of January 6th, that was a moment when democracy was in an hour of maximum peril.
Yes.
Can you just kind of expand on this and expand how American democracy has withstood thus far, but how we still have decisions to make to continue American democracy?
Yeah, well, the plan for January 6th was chaos. Chris Krebs just spoke to our class and talked about how part of the foreign attempts to interfere with our elections and our government is to create chaos. January 6th, and don't listen to me, listen to the Trump people who've testified to this, was to create so much chaos without the certification of the electoral vote that it would be the presidential election would be forced to the House. And if it was forced to the House, it's a unit rule, and the Republicans had a majority. So here's a question. Let's say Mike Pence does not stand strong. Mm-hmm. Let's say he caves to President Trump. Again, none of this is partisan. This is historic. And let's say there's so much chaos it goes to the House, and President Trump is reelected in the House, though we know by every conceivable measure that Vice President Biden at the time, had won the election and the Electoral College. What do you do if you have a constitutional remedy to bring about an unconstitutional result? Yeah. I don't know. How do you adjudicate that? And
adjudication wouldn't have.
But therefore, that was an hour of maximum danger, mm-hmm. because you and I, even 4 years on, in the groves of academe, can't come up with a coherent answer about how the lawfully expressed will of the people, which was lawfully expressed, it was just at risk of not being accepted by the powers that be, who were parties at interest that's how close we came. And I don't think we're out of that particular patch of forest. In some ways, it's just beginning because no one ever thought to do it until now. That's the difference. For a long time, I believed that President Trump was a difference of degree, not of kind, that he was the fullest manifestation of significant forces that were recognizable in American political life. After the 2020 election, through January 6th, was a difference of kind. No one had thought, and if they thought about it, they hadn't done it, to try to just reverse an election. It's just different. And if that's seen as partisan, that's your problem, not mine.
So, on a very different note, in my perusing of the internet about you,
Oh, God.
I found that as a teenager, you wrote a letter to President
Fake
Ronald
news.
Reagan.
Fake news.
That's fake.
It's fake news. And I can't really, it's fake news. I volunteered as an 11-year-old for the Ronald Reagan presidential campaign in 1980.
What do you do as an 11-year-old?
There was a lot of envelope stuffing. You don't even know what an envelope is.
I
But back in the day, there was this stuff
I know
called
what an envelope is.
there was this stuff called paper. And what we did, I was swept up in the Reagan phenomenon. I didn't know a thing in the world about policy or what he meant. It first happened when I was 10, and then I guess I was 11 that year. And I was invited to the inauguration. I did attend the inauguration. The writing a letter thing got into the bloodstream, and because of all things, this is more than you ever wanted to know, of all things, my wife's grandmother, gave a garden club speech about me in which she this is what she thought had happened. And so it got into, this is actually a really good thing about information. So this nice old lady in Mississippi, now dead, gives a speech about something. It ends up in the local newspaper. The local newspaper is part of newspapers.com or whatever. It ends up in an encyclopedia entry somewhere. And it's one of those things that at a certain point, how do you stop it? Anyway.
My question was going to be, what on earth did you put in that letter that as like a child you got invited? But
I wish it, see, I had to undercut myself.
The overlaps in the envelopes, I suppose. So looking at this election at this time when the question is, for some people, protecting democracy in the ballot box, which I would say until recent years, when I would go with my parents to the polls, was not what they were thinking about when they were voting.
Wouldn't even thought about it.
So when voting is the core of democracy, it's giving your voice to elected officials. Why do you think so many Americans take their right to vote for granted? And what do you think can be done to encourage, get out the vote efforts?
Well, the lack of voter participation, or the relative lack of it, is a strange, this may be controversial to say, but many people don't vote because they either don't think it makes a difference, which self-evidently it does, given the margins that decide national elections now, or they think things are fine. And so they're not drawn to a political contest to try to make their lives or the lives of their neighbors better, right? So, and you can talk to, I'm sure there are studies about why people don't vote. What do we do? You tell the story. And the story is that people from Lexington, Concord to Normandy to Selma, Alabama, put themselves on the line, Seneca Falls, to secure a popular government in which we may not have a dispositive voice, but we have an important voice. And I think it's a way of honoring the people who gave everything to participate. That's the noble side. In your own self-interest, it matters who's in office. It just does.
Moving on to our final question, which I will note as I move on to this question that there was doubt we would get here.
There was doubt. Melanie showed me a page after page of question on the way over. But you're doing great.
You grew up in Tennessee.
I did.
In environment that has been kind of jokingly described as folksy by some.
Yeah, do you think I'm folksy?
I mean, not really.
I don't need. I go ahead. Yes, Professor Hemmer said that. Yeah.
So, your upbringing has had clear influence
Absolutely.
on your work.
Sure.
You just talked about growing up in the wake of the
Yeah.
civil rights movement. How do you bring a sense of like humanity and kind of grounded currentness to these historical figures that you are talking about, and how do you think your personal background has shaped this view of history you are able to create?
I think that I don't see how you write biography in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And the way I think of this is I'm a portrait painter. I'm not a portrait photographer, which is I think an interesting distinction. So there's a certain level of interpretation. And we are, as Tennyson said, we're all part of all that we have met. And I know that I was wonderfully educated. I was incredibly lucky all through my life unto this hour to know a lot of vivid people. And there are certain elements of human nature, certain characteristics of human nature that are constant or prevalent. And the characteristics you see in a president tend to be simply exaggerated manifestations of characteristics you see in your neighbor, in the person down the street. And so growing up around Southern politicians, being in journalism for a long time where I saw a lot of different kinds of folks, it creates a bank of experience, a context, a web that therefore when I engage imaginatively with a figure in a nonfiction sense, though I was not there, I think I'm able, because of the web of experiences, to make a pretty good guess about what that room felt like. Mm-hmm. That may not be how I end up writing it, because everything I write I want to be absolutely grounded in fact. But I go back to that Tennyson line. We're all part of all that we've met. And it's a mysterious process often.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mel. You were great. Good questions.
Thank you for listening.